The saloon door swung open with a groan that every man at the bar recognized, and every man at the bar went quiet. Silas Crane stepped inside with the dust of the day still clinging to his coat, and he did not look at any of them. He never did. He walked to the far corner where the shadows pooled thickest, took the same chair he had taken every night for 6 years, and set a coin down on the table with the care of a man laying a stone on a grave. Millie the barmaid brought him a whiskey he would not drink, and she left again without a word, because that was the arrangement, and the arrangement had never once been broken. Outside, the wind was pushing the sign of the Broken Spur back and forth on its hinges, and the sound of it carried into the room like a slow, tired heartbeat. A young cattle hand at the bar leaned toward his friend and muttered something about the meanest man in Wyoming being seated 10 feet behind him. His friend hushed him fast. Silas Crane had once broken a man's jaw in this very room for less, and the story had grown in the telling until nobody could quite remember what the first man had said, only that whatever it had not been worth what came after. Silas sat there for exactly 1 hour. He always did. Then he stood, left the untouched whiskey and the coin behind, and walked out through the back door into the alley where the smell of old barrels and horse sweat and cold night air folded around him. And that was where the story most of the town believed about Silas Crane came apart, because in the alley, in a shallow crate pushed against the back wall of the saloon, there was a wrapped bundle waiting for him. 10 hard biscuits, 10 strips of salted beef, 10 small apples from the orchard behind the mercantile, 10 of everything, every single night, and none of it was for him. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight. Pull the blanket up or set the coffee down beside you, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love knowing who's with us at the fire. Now let me tell you about Silas Crane, and about the 10 small shadows that waited for him behind the saloon in a town called Bitter Fork. He carried the bundle down the alley to the old feed shed the railroad had abandoned 2 winters back. He gave 3 quiet knocks. He waited. The door opened a hand's breadth, and a girl of maybe 12 looked out at him with eyes far older than her face. Her name was Ruth. She had come to him first, a year and 4 months earlier, half frozen and half starved after her mother had died on the road out of Cheyenne. Silas had found her sleeping in the alley behind that same saloon, and something in the way she had looked up at him without flinching had undone something in him he had thought long past undoing. He handed her the bundle. She took it with both hands. Behind her, in the dark of the shed, 9 other children waited on scraps of blanket he had brought them piece by piece over the months. The youngest was 4. The oldest was Ruth. They were the leavings of a hard country. Cholera orphans, widows' children put out when the widow could not feed them, a boy whose father had gone to hang for cattle rustling and never come home. Silas Crane had gathered them the way other men gathered strays, one at a time, and he had told no one, and he had fed them every night for over a year with money he did not have and food he bought at 3 different mercantiles so no single shopkeeper would grow curious. Cold tonight, Ruth said. Colder tomorrow, he answered. She nodded like a woman receiving a weather report and closed the door. He stood there another moment listening to the small voices inside, the quick, soft murmurs of children who had learned that quiet was a kind of survival, and then he turned and walked back into the wind. He was 38 years old. His hands were scarred. His name was hated. And nobody in Bitter Fork, not one living soul, knew what he did in the dark hour after the saloon. Nobody except the woman who had been watching him for 3 nights running from the second-floor window of the boarding house across the alley. Her name was Adeline Vance, and she had come to Bitter Fork on the stage from St. Louis with 2 trunks, a black morning dress she had stopped wearing on the 3rd day of the journey, and a letter of introduction to the schoolhouse the town had been trying to reopen for over a year. She was 29. Her husband had been a doctor. He had died of the same fever he had been treating in the tenements, and she had buried him in the spring and could not walk past their front door without hearing him. So she had answered an advertisement for a schoolmistress in a town she had never heard of, and she had come west because west was the direction that did not contain her grief. On her first night in Bitter Fork, the boarding house owner had told her about Silas Crane over supper, about the fight in the saloon 4 years back, about the horse trader he had beaten senseless, about how his own wife had left him and gone back east, and how nobody had seen him smile since, and how the town would be a better place when he finally drank himself into the ground. Adeline had listened politely and eaten her stew and said nothing. She had learned in her husband's practice that a town story about a man was rarely the man. On her second night, she had seen him from her window, walking down the alley with a bundle under his coat, knocking on the door of the abandoned feed shed. She had watched a small hand take the bundle. She had watched him wait until the door closed before he turned away, and she had seen his shoulders drop half an inch in the dark, the way a man's shoulders drop only when there is no one left to perform for. On her third night, she went down to meet him. He came out of the saloon at the same hour. He walked the alley the same way. He picked up the bundle from the crate, and when he turned, she was standing at the mouth of the alley in a gray shawl with her hands folded in front of her. He stopped. For a long moment neither of them spoke, and the wind moved between them like a third person waiting to hear who would go first. "You'll wake them," she said quietly, standing there staring. He did not answer. "I saw you last night," she went on, "and the night before. My window looks out over your walk." His jaw worked. She could see him deciding whether to be cruel enough to send her running. She saw the moment he chose not to be, and she saw the tiredness underneath the choice, and something in her that had been closed for a year turned its face toward the light for the first time. "They'll be waiting," she said. "Would you allow me to come with you? I brought bread." She lifted a cloth from her basket. Fresh loaves, 2 of them, still warm from the boarding house oven, which meant she had paid the owner extra to bake late, which meant she had planned this. Silas Crane looked at the bread. He looked at the woman. He did not smile, because Silas Crane did not smile. But he did not turn her away. "Walk quiet," he said. "They spook." She walked quiet. He knocked. Ruth opened the door, saw the woman, and reached instantly for the small knife she kept at her belt, because Ruth was 12 and had already learned that new faces were the ones you watched hardest. Silas laid a hand on the girl's shoulder. "She brought bread," he said. "She's a schoolteacher." Ruth looked at Adeline for a long, considering moment. Then she stepped aside. Adeline went in. She did not gasp at the cold, or at the dirt, or at the smell of 10 children in a shed with no proper stove. She knelt down in her good gray shawl, and she started handing out bread with her own hands, and she spoke to each child by asking their name, and she remembered every one of them the second time around. Silas stood in the doorway watching her, and something in his chest that had been carrying a stone for 6 years shifted the stone a quarter inch to the left. When they walked back down the alley an hour later, she said, "You cannot keep them there through the winter." "I know it. There will be snow inside a month." "I know it. Why hasn't anyone helped you?" He was quiet a long time. Then he said, "Nobody's asked what I do at night, because nobody's cared enough to wonder." She stopped walking. He stopped too. In the light spilling from the boarding house window, she looked up at him with an expression he did not know how to name. "I care enough to wonder," she said. He did not answer. There was nothing to add to that. "Now, before I take you where this story is going, I want you to sit with something. 10 children in a shed, and one man who would rather be called the meanest in the county than let a single one of them be seen, and put on a train and split up across 3 states. What would you have done in his place? Would you have trusted her, walking up in the dark with a basket of bread on the 3rd night? Tell me down in the comments. I want to hear. The trouble came from the direction trouble usually came from in Bitter Fork. His name was Judge Alton Merrick, and he owned the land the feed shed sat on, and he owned the bank that held the paper on the saloon, and he owned half the town council, and he had been waiting 6 years for a legal excuse to take the last thing Silas Crane still had, which was a small stretch of creek land 3 miles east that Merrick wanted for a spur line he had been quietly negotiating with the railroad. Silas had refused to sell 3 times. The last time, Merrick had told him, softly, over a glass of Kentucky bourbon, that a man with Silas's temper and Silas's reputation was one bad night from losing everything anyway, and he could either sell for a fair price or wait for the county to take it for nothing. That had been in April. It was now November. And on the morning after Adeline Vance walked down the alley with a basket of bread, Judge Merrick was informed by his clerk that the widow schoolteacher had been seen in the company of Silas Crane after dark, and that a lantern had been lit inside the abandoned feed shed for the first time in 2 winters, and that the shed appeared to contain, of all things, children. Merrick set down his coffee. He smiled the way a man smiles when God has finally handed him the exact tool he has been asking for. By noon he had ridden to the shed himself, with the sheriff and 2 deputies and a writ he had drafted in the 20 minutes it took to saddle his horse. The writ called for the immediate removal of 10 unaccompanied minors from unlawful occupation of private property, their transfer to the county seat at Laramie, and their placement into the care of the Territorial Orphan Authority, which everyone in Wyoming knew meant they would be scattered on 3 different trains within the week. It also called for the arrest of one Silas Crane on charges of harboring, endangerment, and criminal trespass upon the property of Alton J. Merrick. Silas was chopping firewood behind his own cabin when they rode up. He set the axe down slow. He counted them. 4 men, 2 rifles, a writ. He looked past them down the road toward Bitter Fork, and he saw the small figure of Adeline Vance running up the last rise on foot, holding her skirts in one hand and a folded paper in the other, and he understood that whatever was about to happen had been happening for 6 years, and only now had all the pieces finally arrived on the table. Silas Crane, the sheriff said, and he sounded tired, because the sheriff was not a bad man, only a paid one. Judge has questions. Ask them here, Silas said. Merrick nudged his horse forward. He was smiling. The children in my shed, Mr. Crane. Where did you find them? On the road. In the alleys. Half dead, most of them. Where you never looked. They'll be well cared for in Laramie. They'll be split up in Laramie. You know it. I know it. She knows it. He nodded toward Adeline, who had reached them now, breathing hard, the folded paper crumpled in her fist. Judge Merrick, she said, and her voice was steady in a way that made the sheriff look at her twice. I have here a signed letter from the school board of Bitter Fork appointing me guardian of the 10 minors currently housed in the town's charity annex, which is what the shed will be called, effective this morning, per an emergency resolution passed at 7 o'clock this morning by 3 of the 5 council members, which is a quorum. Merrick's smile stayed. It stayed too long. You have no such authority, he said. I have 3 signatures, she answered. Reverend Halsey, Dr. Pickering, and Mrs. Cordelia Yates, who, as you know, is the widow of the previous mayor and holds a permanent seat by the town charter of 1874. You may verify all 3 at your leisure. In the meantime, the children remain in the annex, under my guardianship, and any attempt to remove them will require you to first remove me, in front of the entire town, which I will ensure is present. The wind moved. The sheriff shifted in his saddle. One of the deputies, very quietly, took his hand off his rifle. Merrick's smile finally cracked. You have been in this town 4 days. Long enough, Adeline said, to see what needed doing. She had gone to the Reverend at dawn. She had gone to the doctor at 6. She had knocked on Mrs. Yates's door at 6:30, and Mrs. Yates, who had lost 2 grandchildren to the same fever that had taken Adeline's husband, had signed before she finished reading. Adeline had learned in her husband's practice that the powerful men of a town were rarely the ones who ran it. The women who buried the children ran it. She had gone to the right doors. Merrick sat on his horse a long time. The writ in his hand had, in the last 3 minutes, become a piece of paper. He knew it. Everyone there knew it. And in the silence, Silas Crane took one slow step forward, picked up his axe, and rested it over his shoulder in a way that was not a threat and not, exactly, not a threat. You've got no cause here today, Judge, the sheriff said quietly. We'll ride back. Merrick's eyes came to Silas last. This isn't finished. It is, Silas said. You just don't know it yet. They rode. The dust settled. Adeline turned to him with the paper still crumpled in her hand, and her hands were shaking now that they were allowed to, and Silas Crane, who had not touched a living soul in 6 years except to hand children a bundle of biscuits, reached out and closed his rough hand around her small one, and held it, and did not let go until the shaking stopped. They walked back down to the shed together. The children came out one by one to stand in the pale November sun. Ruth stood at the front. She looked at Silas. She looked at Adeline. She looked at the paper. Does this mean we stay? She asked. It means you stay, Adeline said. Ruth did not cry. Ruth had not cried since she was 9. But she walked forward and put her arms around Adeline's waist and pressed her face into the gray shawl, and the smallest of the children, the 4-year-old named Tobias, walked to Silas Crane and lifted his arms straight up, the way small children do when they have decided about a person, and Silas bent down slowly, as if his back might break, and he picked the boy up, and he held him. If this story is finding you where you live tonight, if you have ever been the one nobody wondered about, or the one carrying something in the dark that nobody knew, then you are exactly who this story was written for. A like and a subscribe tells us there are more of you out there, and it tells us to keep telling stories like these. Thank you for staying with us. That night, Adeline sat with Silas on the porch of his cabin while the 10 children slept inside on every flat surface the small house contained. She had brought them all up the hill herself, one wagon trip at a time, and the Reverend had come with blankets, and Mrs. Yates had sent up 2 hams and a sack of flour and a note that said only, "About time somebody did something." "They'll come at you a different way now," Silas said. "Merrick, he's not the kind that quits." "I know. The creek land. He wants it. He'll find another lever. Then we'll find another door to close." She looked out at the dark, at the shape of the barn and the low line of the hills. "You have carried this alone for a long time." "I wasn't alone," he said. "I had them." "That's not the same." "No," he was quiet. "It isn't." She reached over. She took his hand again. He looked down at where they joined, and he said, very quietly, "I was a worse man than they say, once. Before all this, I did things I can't undo. Feeding them, it wasn't kindness. It was penance." She thought about that a long time. Then she said, "Strange how the things you set out to pay for turn into the things that save you." He didn't answer. There was nothing to add to that. Judge Alton Merrick did try again. He tried through the county assessor, and Adeline had already written to the territorial governor's wife, who had been her mother's classmate at Miss Porter's school. He tried through the bank, and the Reverend organized a subscription that raised, in 9 days, $411 from a town that did not have $411, and Silas Crane paid off the last note on his creek land in cash on a Tuesday morning while Merrick watched from across the street. He tried through a whispered rumor about Adeline's character, and Mrs. Cordelia Yates called on him personally at his office and told him, in front of his clerk, that if one more word came out of his mouth about that young woman, she would personally see to it that every unpaid mortgage he had bought at auction in the last 10 years was reviewed by the territorial court, of which her late husband's cousin was now the presiding judge. Merrick sold out of Bitter Fork in the spring. He went to Denver. He was found dead of a heart attack in a hotel room 2 years later, alone, with no one to send for. His spur line was never built. The creek land, 3 miles east of Silas Crane's cabin, became the site of the Bitter Fork Children's School, one long low building of pine and fieldstone that Silas Crane raised with his own hands, and the help of every man in town who had ever told a story about him at a bar and been ashamed to remember it. He married Adeline Vance on a clear day in June, in front of the school he had built, with 10 children standing in a half-circle around them and Ruth holding the ring. She was 14 by then, and she stood straight, and she did not cry, though everyone else did. Reverend Halsey read the vows. Mrs. Yates gave the bride away because the bride had asked her, and because Mrs. Yates had, in the year since a young widow had knocked on her door at 6:30 in the morning, come to think of Adeline as the daughter she had buried 30 years before, come back around at last. 6 years later, on a warm evening in the last week of October, Silas Crane walked out of his own front door with a lantern in one hand and a small girl of about 5 on his hip. She was the 11th child. She had come to them in August, from a wagon accident on the North Road, and she had not spoken for 2 weeks, and then had spoken only to him. Adeline stood on the porch behind them with her hand on the shoulder of Ruth, who was 18 now and about to leave for the teacher's college in Cheyenne on the following Monday's stage. The rest of the children were inside, arguing gently over a checkerboard. Somewhere down the valley a cow was calling for her calf, and the sound carried on the still air the way sounds carry only in that country, only in that particular hour when the day has finished and the night has not yet begun. Silas set the girl down. She ran ahead of him toward the fence to look at the horses. He stood watching her, and Adeline came down the steps and stood beside him and put her arm through his. "You know," she said, "they still call you the meanest cowboy in town. The new folks, the ones who don't know the story." He watched the girl at the fence. He watched Ruth on the porch. He watched the sun going down over the creek land that had almost been taken from him. "Let them," he said. "A man gets called what he's called. What matters is who knows different." She leaned her head against his shoulder. The lantern in his hand swung once, gently, and threw a soft yellow circle onto the ground between them, and the small girl at the fence turned around and waved, and Silas Crane, who had once been the meanest man in Wyoming, lifted his free hand and waved back. Next time at the fire, We'll tell you the story of a mail-order bride who arrived in a Montana blizzard to find that the rancher who sent for her had died the week before, and the 16-year-old boy left alone on the ranch with 200 head of cattle, a burned barn, and no idea that a woman was coming. Stay warm out there. We'll see you tomorrow night.